This is too easy.
If you're like me, you're always looking for something new to play. Something that feels original, or fresh, or even just different. Familiar games are just fine, just ask my hundreds of hours in Counter-Strike, but sometimes you have a bigger appetite. You start scrolling through your Steam list, or staring at your shelf, and you keep trying out games that don't hold your attention for longer than 20 minutes. Sometimes you just give up and replay an older game, and sometimes you actually find something. I found The Getaway, an early PS2 game by Sony with average to good reviews, most of which relentlessly compare it to Grand Theft Auto. Remember the term GTA clone? Yeah, this was one of those. Apparently this game was highly anticipated, and despite the reviews it sold very well, shipping over 3 million copies. That said, people don't really talk about it anymore, and I guess that's due to its apparent mediocrity. So why did The Getaway hold my attention? Well, like I said, I was looking for something different, and The Getaway aggressively tries to defy conventions in game design. It does away with things like a heads-up display, a map, or a health bar, and replaces them with its own systems. The question is, does it work, or is it just arbitrary? Let's find out. The first thing I noticed about The Getaway was how great it looked. Though no technical marvel by today's standards, it was a feat when it was released, and it's still very visually pleasing, with lots of detail, fantastic animations, decent modeling, and a distinctive realistic style. Granted, I was playing this emulated and upscaled to 1080p, so keep that in mind during this review. Because of this, I won't comment on any glitches that I had. The Getaway clearly takes its inspiration from those two awesome Guy Ritchie films, indulging itself in cockney banter and violence. It doesn't have any of the humor or manage the same level of charm of those films, but it's still quite endearing, and I can't think of many other games with a similar style.
Yeah, get back here.
Eyebrows. Eyebrows.
Behind yourself.
Make the boy listen. Can you hear me? Are you listening now, Marky boy? Put him in the chair.
For the first half of the game, you play as Mark Hammond, an ex-gangster who gets pulled back into the world of crime after his wife is murdered and his child is kidnapped by a rival gang who use his son as hostage to blackmail him into working for them. This is how much screen time his wife and kid have before this happens.
Your dad told me you might be captain of the squad this year. I'm proud of you there, mate.
Mrs. Hammond, could we have a word? We've got a few questions we'd like to ask you.
Yeah? Who's asking?
We'd like to discuss this in private if we could.
You're not the police. Since when did the police start dressing like common tarts?
You bitch!
Yep. 22 seconds. 22 seconds to motivate you to save Hammond's kid and get revenge for his wife, and The Getaway doesn't even try and make you care about them in the slightest. Hammond goes on to slaughter hundreds of people on this mission, and it doesn't help that the first mission has you killing a whole bunch of his old friends and burning down their restaurant. To put it lightly, he's not a very likable protagonist. The intention of throwing the player into the deep end at the start of the game was to immediately get the ball rolling and not to bore the player with exposition, but come on, I need something to care about. It doesn't need to be heavy-handed or drawn out like a Final Fantasy game or Heavy Rain, but at least Heavy Rain let you beat up your kids in the backyard before they got kidnapped. Despite the poor beginning and what turns out to be an inconsistent difficulty curve, The Getaway is decently paced. The cutscenes are well directed, thought has been put into every mission, and even though it's set in an open world, the game is structured in such a way that it never loses focus. Other open world games indulge in side missions and activities which often end up distracting the player from its main quest, which is why I often dislike many open world games, whereas The Getaway simply cuts from mission to mission without any time or incentive to explore. It's noteworthy that most of my favourite open world games are structured like this, such as Driver and Mafia, so this definitely fits my taste. The open world you're seeing is an attempt at realistically recreating the streets of London in a video game, and it's impressive. There's a certain novelty to driving around these virtual streets, and there's so much attention to detail. Complementing this novelty is the selection of real-world vehicles, including manufacturers like Saab, Peugeot, Lexus, Fiat, and Honda, which are some of the more uncommon car brands in gaming. The car damage is surprisingly good with this considered, and a lot of these cars are older models as well, which genuinely adds to a sense of realism and immersion. Even to this day, not many open world games like this have licensed cars, so it's a treat being able to drive them around, with some of my personal favourites being the Nissan Skyline and Honda Civic, which they cleverly use as gang vehicles. It's a shame the driving is a bit shit though. Driving in The Getaway is more than an exercise of patience. You never feel like you have control over the cars, and a lot of the time cornering is just a nightmare. When you crash, which you always will, they take so much damage that it quickly slows them down, if not puts them out of action, or you have to steal another car to continue. On top of this, you're usually on a time limit, so you need to avoid doing this as much as possible, but you're almost constantly being chased by cops or gangsters, which is just chaos. The crash physics themselves are insane, often bearing no resemblance to sense or realism, which adds to the frustration of it all. It's not all bad, however. Some vehicles control better than most, and towards the end of the game I did feel like I was improving at the driving. But aside from the occasional moment, it never became fun. Using the faster sports cars simply for the speed, or the big trucks and buses because you can plow through traffic, ended up being the most effective way of doing it. The perspective the game uses in these bigger vehicles is interesting, opting for a through the windshield view from the back seat, which is a simple way of putting more focus on the character than the vehicle. Halfway through the game, the protagonist switches to a cop, which means that other cops stop chasing you. Once this happens, the driving becomes so much less stressful and claustrophobic, and considering that you spend half of your time, if not more, of this game driving, this is a godsend. The most unique thing the Getaway does with its driving is its navigation system. Instead of using any sort of map, the indicators on the cars simply blink in the direction the game wants you to turn towards, and both blink when you've arrived. The more rapidly they blink, the sharper the turn should be. At first I found this to be pretty cool merely because of its originality, but problems quickly arise. Foremost, you end up circling your destination too often before arriving at it, especially if its entrance isn't too obvious. Keep in mind that you're usually on a time limit, so it's not fun being punished for being uninformed. Also, you never know how far away you are, which means whenever the ticking timer noise starts playing, you let it ring out and fail the mission most of the time because your destination could be right around the corner, when in reality, it could be anywhere. The other gameplay pillar the Getaway rests on is its gun combat, with the occasional stealth sections thrown in. The gunplay revolves around a simple lock-on mechanic, accompanied by manual aim controls, a cover system, and a regenerating health system. As you may have guessed, this has its own share of problems that are almost too long to list, but I'm gonna have a crack at it. The main gripe I have with the on-foot segments is the lack of camera control. Most shootouts involve blindly walking into a room and pressing the lock-on button to find out if anyone's there. This is because you can't manually move the camera at all, resulting in so many trial and error situations only because you can't see anything. Combine this with generally loose and at times disobedient movement controls and things get very sloppy. The same problem affects the otherwise bearable stealth sections, which are predictably affairs of sneaking up behind people and taking them out by hand. You need to see them first for this to be enjoyable, but it's usually not worth the hassle of trying to position yourself correctly just to get the camera to point in the right direction. The most ridiculous part of all this is that the right analog stick is literally unbound. It's not used for anything on foot. Seriously, I looked this up in the manual. There's no camera controls and there's an analog stick that does nothing. Why? Then there's the health system. Sticking to the whole no heads up display thing, instead your health is represented through visible blood wounds on your body, slowed movement speed, and different animations. I have no problem with this. What I do have a problem with is how it handles health regeneration. To regenerate health, you need to walk up to a tall surface and stop. You'll automatically lean on it and magically breathe your wounds away. There's no other way to recover health, so if you're not near a wall, then bad luck, kiddo. Annoyingly, you need to get out of cover to do it, even though it's essentially the same thing. The worst part about it is how long it takes to get back to full health. It's unbelievable at upwards of 20 seconds. This breaks the pacing of the combat entirely and deflates most of the urgency or excitement from it, especially because you lose health so quickly from the hit scan enemies. The most significant thing about the regen system is how it predates the popularity of regenerating health in shooters, but otherwise it's awful. Almost every time I had to do it, I simply used a shortcut to speed up the emulator, and this helped me enjoy the combat a lot more. Without a heads-up display, they didn't bother try to show your ammo count, you're just left in the dark. I actually didn't mind this, as I found for the most part you're given enough ammo and only occasionally run out, which keeps you on edge a bit. You automatically pick up ammo and weapons by walking over them, with the game deciding which weapon is best with its own little hierarchy. You can only carry one primary weapon at a time, except with the SMGs, which you can dual wield, and the only way of switching between weapons is by dropping them. This was an odd choice because the weapons are situational. For example, you may be left in a situation where a shotgun would be preferable to a full auto, but the character dropped your shotgun for an AK rooms ago. Bummer. The cover system is a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, this cover system predates the rise of the cover shooter, popularized by games like Kill Switch, Uncharted, and Gears of War, and it does a respectable job of it, complete with mechanics like blind fire and rolling into cover. On the other hand, it's brought down by poor controls and a general lack of reason to use it. In cover, moving side to side and peeking is far too slow for it to be very practical, and the same button to enter and exit cover is also used to do a roll. Like I said earlier, when you're on low health, your character slows to a crawl, but the roll remains the same speed, so you find yourself spamming it all the time to get around. Unfortunately, if you're slightly close to cover and you try and roll, you take cover instead, even if you're holding the stick in the opposite direction. Also, having to press the button again to leave cover doesn't feel natural. I'd have much rather just being able to walk out. Retrospectively, this cover system can be forgiven merely because of how early it was designed, and it's especially interesting being included in a so-called GTA clone, but that doesn't make it any more useful or fun to use. Even though the gameplay in The Getaway is kind of a mess, it does have some positive notes. Once you're locked onto someone, the actual feel of shooting dudes is excellent thanks to great reaction animations and blood decals. And with the generous auto-lock system, this honestly makes up for a lot of the setbacks. Across the board, the animations for this game are fantastic, especially for the time, though it often seems like the game prioritizes pretty animations over responsive gameplay. The set-piece level design is memorable and keeps the gunplay from getting too monotonous, and sometimes the unscripted shootouts that can arise on the streets between gangsters, cops, and yourself feel straight out of a Michael Mann film. I mentioned earlier that the protagonist switches halfway through the game. In comes Frank Carter, a detective constable who takes the law into his own hands to take down the Jolson gang, the same gang who kidnapped that kid at the start of the game. Mark Hamill's story wraps up nicely halfway through the game, and I initially thought that this character switch would slow the pacing down to a crawl because it recaps Hammond's story from Carter's perspective. I thought that it would have been much more appropriate to switch between the two characters throughout the story, but I was glad to be wrong. Being a cop, Carter is a much more relatable protagonist, and right off the bat his story starts at a breakneck pace as you trail the events of Hammond's citywide gangster rampage. It's cool revisiting areas and events as Carter and seeing the effect Hammond has had on them, which is something that wouldn't have worked if these missions were intertwined with one another. Carter is a character who breaks Hammond out of a cell the Jolsons locked him in. He does this after overhearing Hammond's kidnapping story and wants his help taking down the Jolsons. Initially this seemed absolutely insane to me because as Hammond I killed so many cops. At one point I walked into a police station and slaughtered everyone just to kill one corrupt chief inspector. In Carter's story, I then realized that he never found out about any of this. He only found out about the one guy Hammond was supposed to kill who Carter was going to take out anyway because he was so corrupt. Carter helping Hammond, even though it was pretty silly, made a lot more sense after playing as Carter. I'm not sure if this was intentional by the writers, but it validated the second half of the game for me and made me appreciate an otherwise messy story a little more. Getaway also features a separate free roam mode outside of the main story mode, but the mechanics are so weak that I didn't find any enjoyment in playing it. This makes me glad the story mode is separate from the free roam mode, so I can ignore it entirely. The Getaway is full of dodgy game mechanics and a questionable plot, but I still played through the entirety of it for the first time 14 years later, and honestly, I still kind of enjoyed it. Yeah, the gameplay is nothing to write home about, and the story can be picked apart at every second plot point, but somewhere between the thoughtful mission design, the novel cars, environments and themes, the visuals, the good mission structure, and the pacing kept me going. It has a set of well-meaning yet poorly implemented mechanics that with a lot of tightening up could have come together to create an excellent game. There's a confidence about the Getaway's willingness to try new things that I found so endearing, and even though it's so incompetent, it's also very ahead of its time both mechanically and thematically. I opened this review saying I was after something unique, and say what you will about the Getaway, but you can't deny that that is what it is. It's hard to recommend solely because of its countless setbacks, but if this game looks like it could be your jam, then have a go. It certainly looked like it was mine, and I'm glad I played it. Thanks for watching.